Yeah.
Yeah.
We're always coming.
When are you headed to New York? Wednesday, early Wednesday morning. I'll be gone the next 2 weeks.
County thing?
Well, the first one is the US Open in the county, and then I'm driving down to DC to the Association of Defense. And we'll come back from there. I'm not gonna try and
You guys bringing back a US Open, is that?
no. But on Friday, I'm meeting with Kim Dunn, Director of Competition, the guy that's in charge of the US Opens, the Director of Competition, is the two guys he was saying.
Oh, good.
Who I've met with out here. This is just a follow-up.
Yeah.
And then the day I get back,
Hi, John. Hi, Mary. How are you?
Patsy Sir O'Connell, actually, the day I get back on
Oh,
Thursday.
boy.
Friday, I'm meeting with the Korean Consul General in Seattle.
Good for you.
At the US Women's Open.
Didn't have sense to put it.
15 of the top
I
60
understand.
women golfers in the world are Korean. And that's a market that the SGA didn't realize it could capitalize on here because of our local Korean pipeline.
Yeah.
So I told them about a month ago. So I'm gonna sign that.
It'd be nice to
And
get
the Deputy Consul General was golf in Chambers Bay this weekend. So all right,
that would be a great one to have. Not quite as
I think
big.
we can get that as early as 2024.
What kind of crowd did they get? About half the size?
It's not that much, but it's on TV and prestigious.
Well, that'll be
That's a stepping stone.
absolutely, yeah.
All right. Call this meeting, or this study session of Lakewood City Council for Monday, June 11th to order. The first item for discussion is the homelessness in Pierce County, and for this we have Ms. Cynthia Stewart, President of the League of Women Voters. Please join us at the table.
Good evening. It's very nice to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Whoops.
Not again.
Is this is the microphone? Is that it?
Yeah,
Am I
just
getting
leave it there.
feedback?
It's all good.
I should touch it.
It'll shock you if you touch it.
So anyway, thank you very much for inviting me. I believe I was invited to come as a result of having made a brief presentation to the Pierce County Regional Council back in March. And a lot has happened since then, and so what I'm going to focus on mostly is what has happened since then. But first of all, for those of you who are not as familiar with the League of Women Voters as others are, we're a nonpartisan organization. We do not support candidates or political parties. We do not oppose any of them either. But we do take some positions on certain issues. And we do that after a process involving a study, followed by a consensus decision-making process among our membership. And then finally, if we do that and have a consensus on something, we adopt a position, and then we can take political action. In other words, come and talk to people like you about our position after that point. In the case of homelessness, we have not done a study exactly, but we got involved because a year ago, we did a series of forums on civility and public discourse. And that series of forums had a different format than we usually do. It was just a public conversation, but we had 3 in a row. Each panel was a different angle on the issue of civility. And then what we had was a panel speaking, followed by an audience discussion in small groups, followed by an interchange between the audience and the panel. And the feedback that we got was people really liked that format. It hadn't really been done that way before. Following that, a man named Larry Sequist, and some of you may know him, approached me and said, that was really innovative and different, and I have yet another idea about how to have a conversation in the community about a tough issue on a civil basis. And he proposed a format that we call a CoLab, or community laboratory. And so the community laboratory is the activity that I went and talked to the, I keep wanting to say Puget Sound Regional Council because I worked in King County for a long time, but the Pierce County Regional Council. And how do I do this? There. So last October, what we did was, the preparation was we met. I'm representing not only the league in this case, but also AAUW, NAACP, and RAD, which is a group called Restoring the American Dream. We collaborated on the civility forums, and we collaborated on this. And the reason we chose homelessness as an issue was because it seemed to us that everybody's talking about it. It's this very common topic of conversation. A lot of money is being spent on trying to address homelessness, and it didn't feel like it was going anywhere. So what we did was we convened this CoLab in October, and the CoLab was about 40 people who are stakeholders in that. City and county agencies, churches, shelter providers, all the people listed there, law enforcement, community people who were opposed to homelessness, having any kind of service delivery in their neighborhoods and so forth. And out of that process came some findings, which are that homelessness is continuing to increase, and you are all familiar with that, I know, and that everybody is working on it, but the overall level of coordination and resources needs to be addressed, because there is not enough resource to really deal with the issue, and there is not enough coordination to deal with the policies across the entire county. So this group came up with 4 recommendations, and the process was really amazing, because in a day and a half, we had 40 people of very disparate perspectives who actually came up with 4 recommendations by consensus. The first one is to declare an emergency countywide, and with that, conduct a marketing campaign within Pierce County about what is homelessness, who is homeless, why are they homeless, and try to build up a better understanding. The people that most people think of as being homeless are 5%. They're the ones that are visible out on the street. They are not the classic, they are not at all representative of the homeless population in general. So a public education campaign about why we need more money and why it's legitimate and why these people are not scary, they're safe, and they need help. The second one was to establish a core group responsible for homelessness countywide. Right now, there are 2 groups that are functioning. One of them you are part of. There's a continuum of care committee that is Pierce County, Tacoma, and Lakewood by MOU. And that is a function of housing and urban development funding, and it's a requirement, and then they have invited other people to participate to be part of that. But that's a group of people who are operating at the management level, and they are not policymakers, and so far there's not a lot of evidence that they're dealing with countywide policy at all. The second group is every Friday morning now, there's a group of service delivery people who meet in Tacoma, probably between 40 and 60 every week, and they kind of revolve a little bit, but it's the same core group of agencies. And what they do is they talk about where the gaps are. So somebody says, well, I have a client who needs, a client in a wheelchair who's coming out of jail and needs a place to stay. Or I have a client who has a job, but he doesn't have the steel-toed boots that he needs. And it's at that level of coordination, and it's really making an amazing difference in terms of being able to serve people. But again, it's not an organization that can really deal with how to solve the problem on a countywide basis. The third recommendation they had was that there are some very specific needs that people who are experiencing homelessness have in order to cope with just what they're dealing with, and also to move out of homelessness. So one of them is transit passes. Transit passes would be very, very helpful to people who need to get to work. A lot of the, more than 60% of the homeless population is employed, and, but they have not very much money. Also, access to restrooms is really a huge issue. A lot of the Pierce Transit restrooms have been closed because of vandalism and other kinds of not very nice activity. But what that has done is for the homeless people, it has left them with no place to use a restroom if they're living in their car or they're migrating with a backpack or something like that. And then the third one is cell phones with data service, so that they can actually look up agencies and they can figure out when people are open and closed and that kind of thing. We've done a little bit of work on that, and I could answer a few questions about that later. And then the final one was a longer-term recommendation to take some of the vacant commercial buildings and renovate them into transitional housing. Transitional housing would be very small room units, but people could have their own beds and a little bit of furniture and lock their doors and be able to lie down at night, have a roof over their head, but put supportive services in there with those people, with the understanding that it's a temporary opportunity to get back on your feet. What we know from the data now is that 80% of the people experiencing homelessness, if they can get a little bit of help, they don't recur. So the recurring population, the chronic homelessness population is between 10 and 20%. So 80% of the people could use a little bit of help like that, and it would be a really super good investment. So back to those recommendations, what they did is they also asked the League of Women Voters if we would take a leadership role in trying to make these things happen. And so I went back to my board and said, whoa, you know, this is what we've been asked to do. And they said, well, as long as we don't become project managers, let's go out and see what we can do. And that's why I've been making these presentations. So we got started on meeting with a group, a subset of these people that were in the collab, and talking about a marketing campaign. And all of a sudden we have this opportunity offered to us from another tangential source. The State Historic Museum said, we have a day that we've already paid for at the Tacoma Convention Center, and if you can use it, you can have it. We can't get our money back and our program fell through. So we said, oh, okay. And so within about 2 months of preparation, we put on a forum on April 28th, and we found sponsors. We ended up with a whole lot of speakers. About 300 people came. And the conversation was intended to talk not only about what the problem is, but try to generate some community support for some different kinds of solutions that have been proposed so far. So we were trying to be creative here, and I think to some extent it worked, and to some extent it did not work. But what it did for sure was it elevated consciousness about what's going on. So we had 10 panels. We had a plenary session at the beginning and a plenary session at the end. We had 4 concurrent panels twice. Among all of those, we ended up with 47 speakers and moderators, and their bios are online if you ever wanted to find others who could speak to this issue. Amazing population of experts. We needed about 35 volunteers to staff that whole process, and we had about 300 people attending. The capacity of the convention center is about 800, so that gives you a sense of why it looks so empty, but it was actually pretty good attendance for a warm, sunny Saturday. So it began with Tess Colby, who's up in the upper left-hand corner. She's the person who's in charge of homelessness services and other related services at Pierce County, and ended with me down on the bottom, convening a conversation among 3 elected officials, Victoria Woodard from Tacoma, Connie Ladenburg from Pierce County, and then Senator Jeannie Darneal from the State Senate. And then those are just some other examples of people who were speaking. In the middle is a statement. It says, to successfully end homelessness, we must focus on preventing it. And that is actually a slide from the woman off to the right, who's a UW Tacoma professor, and that was part of her presentation, and I'll come back to that. So what is going on in Pierce County? Right now, Pierce County data says that there are 9,480 people homeless, and 10%, as I mentioned, are chronically homeless. 52% are households with children. 47% are women. 13% have domestic violence going on or did before they became homeless. 9% are unaccompanied youth and young adults, 8% are veterans, and 58% are people of color. What is not on this slide is that there are, among that population, about 30% have mental illness issues that are coincident with homelessness, not necessarily the cause of it. And that does not mean they're all dysfunctional. It just means that they have that coincident situation. And about 20% have chemical dependency issues, and there's some overlap there, of course, as well.
Can I ask a question on the data real quick? So of the 9,480, is this a point in time, or are these people that are homeless for greater than a period of 30 days, or what's the standard?
I can't exactly, Tess has never really clarified that for us, but what I believe it's extrapolation from the point in time, because the point in time survey was only 1,500 or something in that
Right.
ballpark. So it's an extrapolation from that.
That includes housed homeless.
Transitioning.
If you're in a shelter, you're in that number.
Okay.
If you're in a shelter.
If you are sleeping on your friend's couch, you're in that. That's
To get into that number, you have to have been without a shelter for at least 24 hours. Now, what I also want to add is when I talked to the PCRC, one of the issues that I was talking about was that there's a system called the Homelessness Management Information System, HMIS. HMIS identifies about 14,000 people who, in a year, who in 2017, who were experiencing homelessness. So part of the issue about having a coordinating committee is that there needs to be a central place where the data gets grappled with and made consistent, because right now different people are saying different things. I chose to use Tess's because she's the official person here, but some of her own system, it says something differently if you pull it out differently. So basically, this is a lot of people. What I do not have here is a slide, unfortunately, because I didn't get the data in time. There are also unduplicated 4,552 children in the school system in Pierce County who are experiencing homelessness. And that comes from the McKinney-Vento program, which is a federal program required in the school districts. And I will have to send you that slide separately. I thought I had put it in here, but I don't think I did.
That would be in addition to the 9,480?
In addition, unduplicated. And the thing about students is that there has been research that says that any child who experiences homelessness, even for one day, ends up having a much greater chance of being homeless as an adult. So stopping the homelessness for children seems like a really high priority. In addition to that, the longer they're homeless, the more toxic stress they build up, and toxic stress is a lifelong affliction. So it's really important to get at that. Another thing I want to say is that the 58% people of color is in contrast to a much lower percentage in the population at large, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's happening. But that is an alarming number. So what the data also says is that the homelessness is really a result of the current economy, and that is not something that you have any control over, or Pierce County has any control over. But what we're looking at is, are there ways to control the impacts of this on the community? What's happening is that full employment has been widely announced and discussed, but what's really happening is that many of the jobs are at lower than housing wages, which means it takes more money than people can earn in a year to pay for a year's worth of housing. Secondly, in reality, there have been a lot of people who have been removed from the unemployment list because they've been on it too long and no longer eligible for unemployment services or compensation. They've given up, and that population is not counted anywhere. So even though we have, quote, full employment, unquote, we have a large body of people who really are still suffering. And finally, Pamela Oakes is a person who came to speak as a keynote speaker from the Gates Foundation, and she stated that the single biggest cause of homelessness, in Gates' opinion, is the cost of medical emergencies. When I talked to Tess Colby about that, she said, we do not have data that supports that. But I can tell you that anecdotally, that is a big factor for many, many people. So when you're operating on the margin already, and you don't quite have enough to meet your needs, and then you have to go to the ER room, or you have cancer or something that takes recurring treatment, sometimes that creates homelessness. So here are some data to support that comment. The first one is the first graph there, the green line that zigzags up there, that is the median rent change from 2013 to 2018. And the lower line is the median household income change. So what you see is a relatively, and this has been widely discussed in most conversations about the economy anyway, that wages are increasing in very small ratios, and yet the rents are exponentially going up. With a rental vacancy rate of 3%, the market drives the cost, and the cost is going up, and that's now exacerbated by people from King County who have means, who don't want to spend as much on housing there, moving south, and that's been documented as well. So at fair market rate, a 2-bedroom apartment in Pierce County is currently listed at $1,100, and the hourly wage necessary to support that is $21.96 an hour, which is 2 minimum wage jobs. So that's a significant indicator of what the problem is. This is more data of the same nature. The numbers on the left in the green are the income needed for a 1-bedroom and a 2-bedroom rental respectively, so $35,000 and $45,000. And the bars on the right of the turquoise are the respective incomes for various types of occupations, so a standard income or an average. So on the far right, you see an EMT specialist who's out dealing with medical emergencies and crises is making about $35,000 a year. Well, you compare that to the rental rates on the other side, and you don't have any money left for food or automobile or clothing or anything else. And then it gets worse as you go down. So somebody who's a housekeeper or a bank teller is not going to make it. And that's really a picture of the problem that we're dealing with. And that's really the picture that we think the public needs to know, because the public doesn't really see that. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but we have cost burden means that if you're paying about 30% of your income for housing, that's about what you would expect. If you're paying more than 30%, you're cost burden. If you're paying more than 50%, you're extremely cost burden. And some people are paying as much as 80% of their incomes. And that creates a crisis financially for those people. Then we have the supply and demand, and this is in Tacoma. In Tacoma, there are 87 units available for every affordable and available for every 100 low-income households. But you get down to the extremely low income, and there's for every 100 of those, there's only 27 units available. So that's another dimension of the picture here. We do not have enough housing supply that is affordable. This is, I don't need to keep dwelling on this. Another dimension that we talked about in the forum was SPARK. I don't know if you're aware of the study that was done recently that involved 8 jurisdictions in the country, funded by the Gates Foundation, and Pierce County was one of them, and Tacoma was actually a separate one. But and then there were others, some in the Midwest and some on the East Coast. And The general population in the US is 71% white, 12% African American, and other 17%. But a number in the US experiencing homelessness is 65% African American, 28% white, and 7% other. So we have an extreme racial disparity here in the country, and in Pierce County, it's very similar. So while we have 74% white in Pierce County, only 42% of the homeless population is white. We have African Americans are 10.6% of the population, or excuse me, 6.6, and then 26% of the homelessness population. So it's not as bad as it is nationally, but it's not a good picture.
And also, my day job's in the county, and we don't know where those numbers came from. The point-in-time count shows a disparity, but it isn't nearly as great. It shows that 53% of the homeless in Pierce County are white. And it's a disparity, but it's not.
So I can't respond to that because I'm not an expert, and what I'm showing you is the data that was provided at the forum that we did, and this was
I know
provided by the.
those are mystery numbers from Spark.
Okay,
We don't know what the
so,
validation
okay,
for that is.
thank you for that feedback. So, and I think most people are not as knowledgeable as you, so thank you for that feedback, I appreciate it. So the question then is, what can we do? And the League of Women Voters is hoping that people will respond to the 4 recommendations that came out of the CoLab in October, but in addition to that, we think it's time to start looking back at prevention. And prevention has not been addressed because it's overwhelming, for one thing, and homelessness is a result of medical issues, it's a result of education issues, of racial issues, of employment issues, and everything. So every one of those systems, as they reach the breaking point, homelessness is the outcome. So we're hoping that we can start looking at addressing some of those issues more upstream before people get to the point of prevention. I don't have any magic bullets, but it's something that we want the community to start talking about. So I made a presentation to Pierce County last week at their invitation, and and Larry Sequist went with me, and what we said is, one thing that Pierce County could actually do is exercise their regional governance role. They could, on behalf of the whole county, declare a countywide emergency. They could establish a multi-jurisdictional policy coordinating group, give it some authority. They could initiate a public education campaign. They could initiate community conversations about racism. And they could establish a policy of prevention. So those are things that, if the county did those things, it would be a huge, huge step forward. They could also bite the bullet and start talking about new funding. That none of this can happen without more money. And one of the most challenging parts about your job and their jobs is the money issue. There are options such as land trusts that could be funded, and I'm not going to even explain that. I can provide you a paper that was provided by UW-Tacoma if you're interested. But they have the option of adopting a 1/10 of 1% sales tax for mental health and a second one for supportive housing. And so Tacoma has done the mental health one, but I don't believe anything's been done in the rest of the county on mental health, and nothing either in Tacoma or the county has been done on supportive housing. But $13, $14 million a year could go a long way toward paying the debt service on a bond to build transitional housing, for example, with support services. The second thing that's really, I know it's really challenging for elected officials at a local level to start talking about density. Neighborhoods don't want density if they haven't got it already. But it might be time for us to step up and collectively start biting the bullet on that as well. And so we're suggesting that the county in this group that we hope they will form of interjurisdictional members start talking about model legislation that could actually be implemented which would support increased ADU, auxiliary dwelling units, multifamily occupancy, tiny home villages, and things like that. Those are in no way going to be a solution. They will be part of the solution, but they will help the situation immensely. So then the question is, what could you do? What you could do is support the county if they were to do these things. You could encourage them to do it. You could ask for an opportunity to be a part of the voice that speaks out on these issues. You could ask for an opportunity to work with them and deal with some of the issues you've got going on. I know I wrote you a letter about your Loop family home situation, and the only point there was simply, I mean, it was stunning that you have 30% of them here in your city, but part of what has to happen is the whole county has to start working together on solutions, and that means they take some of yours and you take a little bit of some other things. But being part of that voice and part of that conversation seems to me something that you could definitely do. So this is, it's just reinforcing what I just said. So our recommendations are, we need public education badly. People still think that all of the people who are homeless are drug addicts that are derelict and useless, and that's just simply not the case. Another opportunity that you could encourage is use of shared housing services. So if you know people who have, or you could advertise it, people who have extra rooms in their homes could be vetted through the Shared Housing Services Agency. They vet the renter and the landlord and put people together that make a good fit. So in other words, we're hoping that you will get on this bandwagon. We would encourage you to do that. We know that your job is really hard, but I'm here to be a kind of a cheerleader and tell you that if you were to tackle some of these things, that the League of Women Voters and our other organizations would be right behind you. Thank you.
Thanks. I have a question regarding your, you discussed transitional housing. Now, as the funding winds change at the federal government, the people who are in the homelessness industry, the so-called experts, chase the funding that's available. So in the last half dozen to 10 years, there are now less shelter beds than there were. There's less transitional housing than there was. And there was a focus on the most expensive element, which is taking the people who are the most troubled and putting them in permanent supportive housing services. We're using more money per person at the expense of those others. Now, you come back after the symposium and you're talking about transitional housing. What was the interaction and discussion between the various parties in interest, as opposed to if they just had to allocate the money instead of saying we need more money? Is there an open discussion about reallocating what's there now?
There was not. There was not. All of the supportive housing that's available right now is full, and indeed it is costing more per person. Nobody can see a way out of this without more money, without more housing units of some sort. So the transitional housing would be with the intention of not leaving. Supportive housing often has people who stay there, and Catholic Community Services has that, and so do some of the other agencies, and they've talked about how they've been full for years, people are not moving out. Transitional housing would have a requirement that people move on, and they would be given support to do that.
Right, because if we look at it, you talked about prevention too. If you don't deal with the supply, you get Cabrini Green in Chicago, where you warehouse people. And it just becomes more and more expensive and less impactful. So I guess it's encouraging that the industry is talking about transitional housing, but it's discouraging that they're not talking about how to best allocate the money that's there now.
Well, I think that's a topic for the coordinating committee. That isn't something I can answer, but that is something that you should engage in with your peers. That's a very fair policy question, and it's not something I can respond to. I just want to add, Kaiser Foundation announced a couple of weeks ago, because of the relationship between healthcare and housing, a lot of people who become homeless, then end up with much exacerbated healthcare problems. They're going to spend $200 million building housing in, I think, 8 different counties in the state, acknowledging that relationship. So if they're willing to step up and do that, I'm hoping others will as well. But that's an acknowledgement of the need. The reality is that until we get higher wages for people so that they can afford market rates and the markets get slowed down a little bit, until that gap gets filled, it's going to continue to increase.
Mr. Bulkey.
So you touched on transitional housing. My question is what's the industry standard on transition? I mean, is it 6 months, a year, 2 years? Because you touched on that nobody ever leaves, so there's,
That's
like
supportive
we built housing here in up the street. Lawson did. I think we were told one night that it was going to be transitional. It's not. It's permanent. People moved in. So what is transitional?
I am, again, not an expert, but I'm a cheerleader. But what I will say is my understanding is it's 3 to 6 months. It is not 2 years, 4 years, whatever, indefinite. And that there's an agreement that when people enter it, that they must leave. But then the intention also is that it's not just a place to live, it's also a place where they get help moving on.
Okay. Thank you.
There is some grant funding that's tied to a 2-year max. But there's not a hard and fast rule that I know of.
It's a
That was
conundrum.
VA funding that had a 2-year max. Mr. Branstad.
Mr. Stewart, thank you for being here today and following up on following the fact that the League of Women Voters has been trying to, first of all, the civic discourse and add clarity around the issue of homelessness as to better define it, which has been the problem. In your I have a couple questions, though, about the recommendations and the process that led to them. At the forefront of the recommendations is for Pierce County to declare an emergency. And I'm not really sure what that does or what the significance of that is, other than do all the rest of the things. I mean, what does the emergency declaration do? Does that open up funding? Is it just to put a bullet point on an information campaign? I'm a little bit confused about the impact of why that's the recommendation is at the forefront, on the top of every list.
The people who originated that back in October, as well as the people who echoed it later, feel that it emphasizes the urgency. And the best way to say it is, if we had a fire that burned down homes and we had 10,000 homeless people and 4,000 more children, we would be doing more than we're doing right now. And so it's to call the public's attention to the crisis nature of the situation and to call out for help. It also might increase the opportunity for funding.
One of our categories of homelessness in Lakewood that we have been looking at has been people who are probably not captured by your numbers, but people who are living in extremely substandard housing units, conditions, being able to go and do that. Our thought is that solution is not any roof. The solution is a safe and healthy roof, okay, to be able to go and do that. But the data that's being gathered by people who are concerned about homelessness and are in the business of trying to help the homeless, don't seem to have the quality of housing, only the cost, you know, and you could move this data by moving a lot of people into very substandard conditions, and I'm really concerned about the period of time that tiny houses remain in good repair and remain as safe, you know, to be able to go and do that. And so as you move forward, as I think that there will be your efforts will result in some motion on the parts of municipalities and agencies across the county that I encourage you and your folks to not lose sight of quality in addition to the need for more housing.
Thank you for that. I think that's a huge issue. And one of the things that